Hi, I'm Bruce Novak, organizer of the just concluded conference, Literacy for Love and Wisdom, and co-author of a book to be published tomorrow, Teaching Literacy for Love and Wisdom, Being the Book and Being the Change. Those of you who know a tiny bit of Greek will understand that the title of the book is a translation of philosophy, philosophia, love and wisdom. I originally proposed the title for the book, Literacy and Philosophy, and the publisher said, who would ever buy that? So I simply decided to translate the term philosophy into literacy for love and wisdom, and their immediate reaction was, who wouldn't want to buy that? And in fact, this book is now being co-published by Teachers College Press of Columbia University, probably the most distinguished educational press, and the National Writing Project, which decided to co-publish within weeks after hearing that their entire federal funding allotment had been withdrawn. They found it to be that important. And the National Council of Teachers of English. So the potential audience of this book is fairly large. Its capacity to propagate wisdom through the world is quite large. This is coming upon a very strangely lived life. And it's in many ways the summit of that life, which has been lived by and large in at least an academic wilderness. Let me say that the conference is being staged by a group called the Assembly for Expanded Perspectives on Learning. And the book is dedicated in part to that assembly. And I feel, which has in many ways been both my academic and my personal home for many years. And it in some ways attempts to sum up the intellectual and human work of this assembly and to reclaim its claim on the profession of English as an assembly for wisdom in the humanities and human life, and to also claim that what we have called English as a subject matter for the past 100 years has always secretly, but not quite so secretly, been about the propagation of wisdom, of personal wisdom in human life. So let me tell you the story of how the ideas for this book came to be. And I will tell it first in personal terms because I think that will be more gripping for most people watching this, and then in historical terms because this is not something I'm just inventing or randomly altering the profession for. I first claimed in some ways the role of the philosopher in the 6th grade when we were asked to choose our hero, and I chose Socrates. I'd been reading through the encyclopedia called the Book of Knowledge, and I was compelled by the story of Socrates, who gave up his life to stand up for what he believed in, and for his right to openly inquire. And from that moment, partly because my teacher, who really had saved my life, was Greek, I saw myself as a philosopher from the age of 11. But what that meant has changed for me very much over the course of the years. By and large, in the beginning, it was somebody who was smart and questioned everything. Only very slowly did the notion of wisdom come to be central to philosophy for me. So let me tell you some of the ways that developed. I went to the University of Chicago, the center of liberal education, perhaps in the world, and thought that being a philosophy major would fulfill all of my life dreams in this academic institution. Lo and behold, I was not very good at the games that were called philosophy at the university. And I then decided I wasn't a philosopher. At the same time, I happened to have taken a course that was titled in the course book, What is Wisdom Literature? It was my freshman humanities course. It was offered by a scholar of Byron. The readings include a little bit of philosophy, but the Bible, Thoreau, Montaigne, the first personal essay writer, Moby Dick, Pride and Prejudice, a lot of modern poetry, and the complete philosophical investigations of the philosopher Wittgenstein. The title of this course was not even published. It was called Introduction to the Humanities, but it lay in the back of my mind that there was this course called Wisdom Literature. So that, just remember this like a leitmotif in Wagner's Ring, because it'll pop up about an hour later in this interview. Just hopefully joking about the hour. We had a few crazed eyes there, so I thought I would clarify that. I became, in the next year, as I was I was getting B's in my philosophy courses and not enjoying them. And at the same time, a friend of mine who was a history major had convinced me to take a survey of English literature in which a different professor from the English department appeared each week to talk about a different topic in the history of English literature. And this was a gas. And these people, I enjoyed them as human beings, and I learned so much about life from them. I didn't put the word wisdom on them because that word it seemed to be a pompous word to me at that time. But looking back on it, I chose to become an English major. And obviously this is relevant for the course of my life, because I saw the professors of English as being far, far wiser and deeper than the professors of philosophy. And I wouldn't have used these words to describe it, but I was becoming wiser by writing papers about literature than I ever was, by leaps and bounds, by writing papers for philosophy classes. So I went through a number of personal difficulties I won't describe in toto, but that largely involving my parents' divorce. Became lost to the world in some ways, although that those ways professionally involved my becoming a waiter at fancy restaurants. But I became, most of all probably, though certainly enjoying life, lost to myself. Still read, but my reading was unfocused, undirected. There was no purpose to my reading other than illumination and pleasure. It was not taking my life any way out of this being a waiter. Two things happened, I think, around the year 1983 or so. The movie My Dinner with Andre came out, which was an hour and a half of two people just talking about what was meaningful to them. And I realized that something essential was missing from my life. And I read a book by a Wittgensteinian philosopher that my humanities professor had turned me on to, named Stanley Cavell, a very distinguished professor of philosophy at Harvard, who also wrote extensively about literature. And that book was called The Senses of Walden. And in that book I ran across the following sentence, which became my life motto, and still is my life motto. It's part of the book. To be a philosopher is not merely to have deeper or subtler thoughts than other men, or to found a school, but so to love wisdom as to live a life according to its dictates, a life of independence, simplicity, magnanimity, and trust. Reading that sentence allowed me to reclaim the identity of philosopher. And that was an essential moment in my life, as a lover of wisdom, not as a smarter person or as somebody who goes to the University of Chicago and studies with the smartest people there, but as someone who lives a life. And I think it's important to see the order of those words. independence, who was not codependent with any person or group. Simplicity, who does what is necessary. Magnanimity, probably the most important word. We usually think of it in terms of money, but it means literally great souledness. And finally, trust that one's life matters. Trust that even if you're not going to see the results in life, that one's acts, if they are wise acts, will make a difference in the course of things. So, here I have to confess things become a blur. I happened to fall in love with a woman who said she did not want to have a long-term relationship with a waiter. And so I took plan B. I decided to become an English teacher. She was very generous. She did allow me a year to complete my philosophical system, the phenomenology of the heart, which was a second inversion. When you have chords in music, there's a first inversion and a second inversion. It's quite well known that Marx said that his philosophy was Hegel turned upside down. And I loved Hegel, and I thought that we could arrive at the truth about life simply by turning Hegel inside out. And I won't explain how I did that, but it was certainly absorbing for my mind for quite a number of years to try to work this out. I became an English teacher, and I was lucky enough not to get the kind of job I wanted, which was to teach rich kids liberal education, the same path that I had pursued. I was dumb enough about looking for jobs that I only got certified to teach a few days after I had gotten a job that I would have had to start. So I ended up getting a job in a black Catholic high school in the south side of Chicago. And I must say that despite all of my reading, this was where I began to get real wisdom. It was the hardest year of my life. I had to learn to communicate with people I had never had to learn to communicate with before. I had to learn from my students, and I never became very good about it. But I think I learned the lessons about being wise as, first of all, trying to communicate in all circumstances. Second of all, seeking to go out where one is not sought to heal the world where it doesn't ask to be healed, which is always a difficult proposition, as Socrates knew. I pursued this career with varied success, but from being able to have a dialogue about a question of importance to them, and why this was so easy for my former students. Relatively, it was not easy for them to work through the question, but it was very easy for them to find a personally important question. And what I saw was that and these were all principals, most of them were principals, who were seeking a superintendent position. And what I saw was that these students had gone through the public education system, which was a system that was geared toward the production and ingestion of knowledge, and just had no truck with wisdom whatsoever, had no truck with the personal. So that this course in their doctoral education was actually, for all of them, the very first course that was concerned with their wisdom and their growth and their learning, and they didn't know how to approach it, despite their intelligence. So the next day I went in, and we just had simply a discussion of the difference between knowledge and wisdom. And that everyone had an intuitive knowledge of the difference. Everyone knew that school was focused entirely, at least their schools were focused entirely on knowledge and not at all on wisdom. And everyone knew that wisdom was inherently far more valuable than knowledge, and just that schools had chose not to have any truck with it. They could all name the wisest person in their lives, and they could all name why that person was wise. It was in each case, because they had insights into them. They were able to understand them and their ways and beings in life, what was wrong, and how they might go about finding better ways of living. The most frequent answer to the question, who's the wisest person you know? My grandmother. And my work in biology has given some biological substance to that you can find in the book. So, starting in the fall then, I started teaching undergraduates. And I was blessed with a class similar to the doctoral students in that they hadn't had much experience with wisdom in their education, and yet when I made this question, the initial question of the class, and was able to focus all of the readings around this question, the character of the classroom became transformed. The students were students who were beginning to formulate a vocation of a teacher, but had not yet been professionalized. And those two facts were both key, because I found that most everyone who seeks to become a teacher of any kind has had a wise mentor that has led them into that decision, whose lives they wish, if not exactly to imitate, at least to follow from. That they've been so moved by that mentor's insight into their lives that they've decided to pattern their own lives on that mentor. And I was then able to structure a series of assignments that, in retrospect, were systematically, more or less systematically, devised to evoke the wisdom of a person's life, and then to catalyze that wisdom for the life of teaching, so that it could propagate, so that wisdom could propagate on others. So let me share the methods that I developed. After the first week of class, the students were asked to write a 2-page essay describing their personal growth in wisdom to this point in their lives. Now, of course, this sounds like a monumental undertaking. I used techniques of creative writing that I'd learned when I was an English teacher to help them with this. It was very difficult for many students, but I had a due date, but I gave many, many extensions. And as the students saw one another focus on an incident, a transformative incident in life that had helped them become wise through their understanding of the traumatic nature of that incident. So let me give you a few examples that I can recall. Not all were traumatic. I'm going to give you a traumatic one, and I'm going to give you a sort of miraculous one. The first one that I always give to my students is the miraculous one. It involved just an average student. I think he got a B or C in the class in the end, who was called to become a special education teacher. He had a service learning requirement in high school, I think, and he went and he had a relative who worked at a camp for special education students. And he happened to see a girl with cerebral palsy going in for a swim with the biggest smile on her in her life. And that was an epiphany for him, because he was able to see that not only did he have no right to the self-pity that he happened to be enmeshed in at that age, but that if he could shed that self-pity, he could become not just accustomed to whatever was dragging him down in life, but could become a model for how to overcome whatever emotional disabilities we're all beset with. And that moment led him to his calling to become a special education teacher. Another example that I recall as being very poignant was a young man who had two brothers who had a rare disease at birth, and they were younger brothers, and he saw them born and grow to be a few years old and then die one by one. And this typified the kind of wisdom experience of the realization of how precious life is, and so how one should measure one's moments and be devoted. He had tattoos on each of his arms for each of his brothers, and he devoted his life, obviously he was a survivor, he devoted his life to the love that he was never able to express for those two brothers. And of course, I think he was becoming a gym teacher. Memory fades though. I also noticed, speaking of gym teachers, that as much as I was afraid of teaching physical education teachers, they were the only subject matter in which wisdom was consciously acknowledged. Because, first of all, we valued the goal of sports very highly in our society, and so we don't want to produce standard athletes, we want to produce excellent athletes as opposed to standard everything else. Secondly, the personal nature of coaching, as opposed to what we call teaching, but should be called instruction. It's not real teaching. It's simply implanting of something in a human being that's not human. It's not human teachings of humans, but simply an artificial implantation that doesn't last very long. Through this course and seeing, so the first assignment is the growth in wisdom. The second assignment, which was very challenging for many students, the second assignment was almost always very easy. It's based on an essay of mine you can Google called Seeing Teacher-Student Relationships as Hidden Dramas of Personal Development. So I asked them to tell the story of their relationship with a teacher, and one by one, it was a very easy story for them to tell because the insights that their influential teacher had shared with them had blossomed in their own lives in their very taking of this class. And I call this, those of you who know psychoanalysis, there's a term Nachträglichkeit, which means deferred action. And it's always used with trauma. Something gets under your skin and is so shocking that you can't process it. And it stays in you, and you develop symptoms such as hysteria later on in life. Well, there's a different Nachträglichkeit, or deferred action of care. Somebody cares about you. You might not even realize that they're caring. But that care gets under your skin and plants seeds of care that grow in you and propagate and draw you, often quite unconsciously, to be capable of caring later on in life. So this, I see, is what distinguishes wise teaching. It's the care for individuals, seeing their lives as stories and recognizing that one can play a part for the better in those stories. So with this scaffolding and the additional scaffolding of writing a short paper about one's personal call to teach and the development of that, drawing from the work of Parker Palmer, enabled the students then to write dialogues in which they blossomed as wise teachers and as wise human beings. And that word was one that I consciously used because I continued to use the journaling process, and I learned not to comment on my students' journals. And I saw this process as them seeing themselves as a growing plant. And what the plant does is it first extends its roots into the ground. And if you disturb the ground too much, you disturb the roots. So I simply let them reflect without commenting on their reflections. Then there comes a time where they're building their dialogue, where the dialogue at this point was conceived not just as a question, but as a burning existential issue in their lives as teachers. So in other words, about their personal lives as teachers, not about teaching in general. And at a certain point in the term, about a third of the way through, I would give up my entire life and I would begin reading their journals. And I would have, they were therapy sessions, really. in which what I did with the journals was I simply highlighted the passages that I found meaningful and that I found related to one another. So in other words, I was reading these journals as a kind of indication of their life story and the meaning of that story and the questions of that story. And so I was then capable, when they came to me with their question, of helping them refine what that question was by pointing to passages in their journals. And so this method did not succeed with all students, and it particularly didn't succeed with students who conceived of themselves as smart and played that game very well and didn't want education to be anything else than that. But the successes that it had with students that it got to was absolutely remarkable, one after another after another. There's a quote in the book that I'm going to just try to remember. And I think it came from someone significantly that I was not personally close to, that our personal interactions were limited to a few exchanges and comments on papers. And here is the response to the course. My life and the way I interact with other people in life have been totally altered by my taking this course. This was the hardest course for me by far. It was the same doctoral course, another year. This was the hardest course for me by far because I did not want to change. But no one can take this course and have the experience of this course and not at least think about fundamental change. I learned that one must change first within and then change the world. And I will always love and thank you for teaching me this lesson. You know, if you'll recall the title of my book, in some ways this was the origin of the title of the book, being the book and being the change. That is, in other words, as we fully live and inhabit the stories of our lives, we are able to affect the larger story of life itself. And this is my understanding of wisdom, particularly as it pertains to education. Okay. One line of my life that I have not said anything about is that around 1996, I got involved in a movement called the Politics of Meaning, who started by Rabbi Michael Lerner, but many well-known intellectuals and spiritual leaders such as Cornel West have participated in this movement. Cornel West is still a leader of it. It's now called the Network of Spiritual Progressives. I still prefer the term the Politics of Meaning for obvious reasons, the meaning. And through that movement, Hillary Clinton first brought it on the national scene. She gave a speech about it in 1993. Through that movement, I met in 1996 through a conference I was putting on called, believe it or not, Reawakening Hope in a Time of Cynicism. One small participant in that conference was named Barack Obama. He was obviously a shining star. He had just been elected to state senator. He hadn't even served yet. And one of the people with whom I staged this conference was one of his mentors. Sam Ackerman was his name. So that in the midst of doing this work, and the work itself was changing, they were giving me cohorts of students who were just about to graduate, who were not quite ready to have their world turned upside down. So though some still were, many still were, but the majority were not. And it was, I actually had a very interesting day in my class where I simply walked out of class after having had a dialogue about Socrates' defense, and my question was, should I continue to teach? I won't tell you more about that, but it was very interesting results. So my work was becoming both much harder, less enjoyable, and at the same time Barack Obama declared his candidacy in February of 2007. And for me, it was a chance to really develop for the public world in an important, perhaps important way, the ideas I had been developing for my students that had been so effective in getting them to seek to lead a wise teaching life. So I was lucky enough to have a partner at that time who was able to support me both emotionally and financially in this decision. And I began to research and started to try to write about what wisdom was in education, as well as the history of wisdom in general. So in conjunction with my colleague Stan Scott of the Assembly for Expanded Perspectives of Learning I spoke of earlier, we began to plan a conference called Reclaiming the Wisdom Tradition for Education. The wisdom tradition was a phrase I believe may have been invented by Houston Smith and was also employed by Michael Nagler, who worked in the Politics of Meaning movement. He's a great peace activist and author of the book The Search for a Nonviolent World, a great scholar of Gandhi as well as a classicist. So in the course of that, I encountered a work by the religious scholar Karen Armstrong called The Great Transformation. And in that book basically starts with a sentence that we need a spiritual revolution to compensate for our technological genius. And without such a spiritual revolution, it is unlikely that we will be able to save our planet. And in this book, she went over the period of history called the Axial Age by the philosopher Karl Jaspers, in which there was this great sudden flowering of wisdom in the world that in some ways has become permanent, even though it's still not the major force in the world. This flowering took place in Greece through tragedy and philosophy, particularly in the character of Socrates, who both experienced a seeming tragedy and embodied philosophy, through Confucius, who in some ways was the most successful sage of them all because he did infiltrate the empire, and Confucianism became the dominant mode of education in China, although of course it did eventually become corrupted. Buddha, probably those of you listening to this or watching this will have a lot of acquaintance with Buddha, but Buddha as an enlightener, as a finder of happiness, and also Jesus. And I recently have taken to adding Muhammad, although I do not know much about Islam, but through the help of my friend Tom Gage, who works with the Gulen Foundation, which is an Islamic humanist foundation, and taking a course on Rumi, I think Muhammad probably belongs among this group of exemplary seekers of wisdom. So I was able in my work for the conference to tie the axial age of the first millennium BCE to the concept of partnership culture that my friend and mentor Rian Eisler came up with, which is that there are basically two patterns of culture in human history existing on a continuum, and that is dominator culture and partnership culture. And that these actually have a history. That partnership culture, existed as part of human existence for a long periods of time, but particularly flourished in the Neolithic agricultural era, in which the first goddesses we know were fertility goddesses, not men at all, and men did not dominate women in social life. So my hypothesis, which I go through in the book, is that what happened in the axial age in terms of the scope of human history was not just an accidental blossoming of wisdom across these various cultures, but in fact a reclaiming of partnership culture within the human person, where before it existed in general social relations. So in the chapter of my book called The History and Possible Future of Wisdom, the first part is called Partnership Culture When Wisdom Was Natural. The second is the axial age, when wisdom became something internalized in the human person. So what Armstrong was calling for was basically a new democratic axial age, where wisdom would be consciously infused, facilitated in each individual human person. Okay? This is my mission in life, but it's not original to me, fortunately. I've come to understand in general, the humanistic tradition, and particularly the tradition I call democratic humanism, as seeking this very goal. And that the field that came to be called English, actually started in the thinking of people like Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Schiller, Goethe, Emerson, and Matthew Arnold, on whom I wrote my dissertation, and Walt Whitman, whose democratic vistas was the main topic of my master's thesis. So, in other words, there was this tradition of thinking and liberal education, to me best captured by a few lines from Emerson. At the end of The American Scholar, which obviously was the main text for Thoreau, and because it was based on the central virtue of democracy being self-trust. At the end of The American Scholar, he says, "A nation of human beings will for the first time exist when each person believes each other person infused with the same divine soul they're able to see in themselves." Okay. So there you get the formulation of it. Another great sentence from Emerson is, "Let us treat the people as if they were real. Perhaps they are." Now think of that in terms of how we do education, how little reality students have in comparison with the subject matter they're instructed in. So the question is, how do we then bring, in a certain methodical, systematic, publicly accessible way, apart from the separate, somewhat esoteric, somewhat culturally bounded traditions that we've inherited. What my book does, and Jeff Wilhelm's book, I'll leave the story of how the book came to be and how Jeff came to see this work and feed into it. I'll leave to those people who choose to read the book. Is to see human life in terms of story. I was very moved at the Spirituality Education Conference at which the Dalai Lama and Parker Palmer spoke, to hear these lines from the philosopher Rachel Remen, who has a book called Kitchen Table Wisdom. She said, "Everyone is a story." Stories are what heals us, what connects us, and the more we tell each of our own stories, the more we realize that all of these stories are part of the one story that binds us all. This was what I saw when I was teaching my students in my philosophy of education classes, and what I wanted to do was get a rationale so we could get society to understand the meaning of what I in the book call story time. That is, that stories are gifts, and art in general, and teaching in general, is a gift that we receive from the past in a present moment that seems like a transformative miracle of new wisdom coming to us, that then enables us to give caringly and feedingly into the future. How that translates in the book is as, first of all, a somewhat methodical pedagogy of art based on John Dewey and Louise Rosenblatt and my co-authors' understanding of aesthetic transaction. What happens when we read, when we're immersed in the flow, present flow of a work of art, when we identify with characters and authors who have given something of themselves to us, and then see something new in our own lives, in our own existential courses, by being immersed in this new environment and receiving the life that another has given to us. So there is a method of sorts of teaching art as the entering into wise story time. Okay? And then we extend that into story time in general. That is the story time of our teachers in school and out of school, who have, stemming from my very first article that I spoke of earlier, where we see our relationships with students as having the potential to generate wisdom if we play our roles with them well. And artfully design teaching, and artfully convey a wise perspective of a good enough world, what in the book I call a good enough world, from the philosopher Jonathan Laird. And then we have a picture of democracy as government of, by, and for people, for the shared life of people, not just for practicalities. So that democracy as what Aristotle called true friendship, where we live for one another, not just with one another. And also seeing that one story as in some ways the story of wisdom, the story that develops slowly over time, and that now we are called to rapidly proliferate. I borrow a concept from the physicist Peter Russell of the wisdom revolution. He says, and I think this might be a good time to end this, that we now, at this period of time, which I also quote Stanford comprehensive historian Ian Morris, he says, this period of time in the next 40 years is the most important in the entire million-year history of the human species. We are facing a cosmic intelligence test that we need to learn to pass in order to assure our state on Earth, our stable state on Earth. And I add to that, at the same time as we're facing a cosmic intelligence test, we are providing our children with nothing more than blinders to the real needs that our species face. In other words, we're giving them meaningless tests at the same time that we, ourselves, as a species and the planet, are being faced with the mother of all tests. So this is why wisdom literacy is critical in the human species. Please read the book, disseminate its ideas, encourage your teachers in particular, particularly English teachers, to read the book and use it with their students. And by the time you see this video, how many more materials will be generated from this conference. And my next project is actually the reason I went to graduate school, is called The Opening of the American Heart, the Great Educational Awakening on the Horizon of Democratic Life. And thank you for listening to this long wisdom literacy interview that's reflected really a life that has been pretty thoroughly devoted to the cultivation of wisdom and literacy.